Okay, great. We are recording. So really excited to have one more installment to have you learn a little bit more about the Barryvox products that are on the market. We're here with Doug Workman, and he is going to tell us about some of the products that are on the market and give us sort of a deep dive onto some of those features so that you can feel comfortable teaching them to students. So Doug, I'm gonna stop talking and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Emma, and thanks everybody for attending. It is still odd for me in these Zoom times to be speaking to a screen and not seeing anybody. So if you do have questions, please throw them in the chat, and I believe Emma is going to be monitoring those. And you may also, Emma, correct me if I'm wrong, have an option to speak up as well. So we are going to be, hopefully, okay, so I think I got the screen share going. And we are going to be doing a deep dive into the Barryvox S, and some of the slides I'm going to be relying on are from a training that I do for professional groups, but this is not going to be geared toward professionals specifically. It's just more going to be a dive into the features of the Barryvox. And I think a good place to start is in this metaphor that I would guess a lot of people are familiar with, but it's very, I think, helpful in terms of understanding how Barryvox approaches engineering their beacons. Oops, I thought I had shared the screen. So I'll actually be very interested in whether people feel this is any of the nuances of this deviate from the ARI curriculum. Some background from me, I work as a ski guide and mountain guide in the Tetons, and I've done that for the last 20 some years. And I work for Mahmood as their avalanche safety program manager. And a lot of what I do is train professional groups. And we will get into talking about some of the different advanced features of the Barryvox S, but we're going to start with just the very basics. But it is helpful, I think, to review this airplane metaphor that the Swiss rely pretty heavily on, not only for teaching entry-level users, but as a great tool to remind folks of what we consider best practices. And it does really come back to some important features that are specific to the Barryvox. So of course, the first stage of any search is a signal search. And interestingly enough, which I don't envy the instructors that have to now be experts of so many different models of beacons on the market. But one of the things that I find very interesting working with ski patrols and search and rescue groups and guide services is that a lot of people don't really seem to know what their recommended search strip width is of the beacon. And they also don't seem to know how manufacturers arrive at that search strip width. And it's interesting, because for better or for worse, a lot of different brands and models have very different recommended search strip widths. And the other thing that I realize in talking to folks is that people don't really tend to trust the recommendation from the manufacturer, regardless of the brand or the model. So I think that's an important thing to review. So both Barryvox models, the Barryvox and the Barryvox S, have a recommended search strip width of 70 meters, which is definitely a highlight of the beacon. It's kind of a stand apart, although beacons do tend to, of all brands and models, tend to continue to have longer and longer recommended search strip widths. But I think folks probably, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but can folks, when they're looking at my screen share, still see my face? So can I show things on the screen?
Yep, I believe so. I have it set up so that it follows the host view, and my view is you next to what you're sharing. Can someone just drop in the chat and let us know? Okay, people are saying they can see you.
Awesome, great. So my guess is that people are really familiar with the fact that the range of a beacon is in part determined by what is referred to as the coupling of the beacon, meaning how the beacons are oriented towards in relation to each other. And of course, modern beacons have 3 antennas, but it really is the long antenna, the X antenna, that affects the range of the beacon. The other antennas are more helpful in terms of accuracy. So when long antennas are in line with each other, you're going to achieve the greatest possible range. And when those antennas are perpendicular to each other, you're going to have the worst possible range. Of course, you do not know the orientation of the buried victim. So your recommended search strip width, and this is true with all manufacturers, is going to be based on the range in the worst coupling. So it's going to be based on the worst possible range. So with this beacon, we have a recommended search strip width of 70 meters, and that's based on the fact that when the long antennas are perpendicular to each other, you have a range of at least 35 meters. So that's the first thing to understand. And of course, if your range is limited to 35 meters, you are still searching that full area of the zigzag, so to speak, because you're achieving 35 meters of search at the top of the zig and 35 meters above you from the bottom, from when you're standing at the bottom of the zig or the zag. Now, of course, we never really want to be below the victim, but please keep in mind that the point of what I'm saying is that you would be effectively searching the given terrain, even if the beacons were in worst coupling 100% of the time. And of course, it's going to be almost impossible to be in worst coupling 100% of the time, because simply by moving and walking down the path, you're going to inherently be changing the orientation of the beacon. And that in and of itself is going to ensure that it's nearly impossible to be in worst coupling. So with a 70-meter search strip width, you should actually be over searching that terrain. You should have a lot of confidence that that recommendation is going to allow you to effectively search that terrain. And of course, Barryvox for a long time has always recommended that to make sure that you're not in worst coupling, to increase the chances, in fact, that you're in best coupling, we've always recommended rotating the beacon on the XYZ axis. And the additional reason we really like people doing this is not only to hope that you acquire the signal by finding best coupling, but it's to hold the beacon at your ear, because when you do acquire a signal, you're going to hear an audible double beep. And what I believe to be the very most important reason to hold your beacon by your ear during signal search and rotate it is to make absolutely sure you're not staring at your beacon. As we all know, if you give somebody a screen, it's very hard not to look at the screen. And so this is a habit forming thing. If you get in the habit of holding your beacon at your ear during signal search, you become much more effective at not looking at your screen. Of course, most people that are caught and carried in avalanches are not completely buried. So the chances are you're actually going to find yourself with just searching with your eyeballs. And I believe that is something that doesn't get emphasized enough. And in fact, I don't think we even really practice signal search very often, because it's so challenging to set up drills with that amount of space that typically the most often, I believe, the drills that we set up, when you go into search, you're very quickly acquiring a signal, which is one of the reasons I think we're looking at our screens too often, and we're not really focusing on what is the search strip width capability of your beacon. And of course, it's one thing to know what the recommended search strip width is of the beacon in terms of a number that's written in a manual. You all probably are aware of the fact that even though these numbers are generally meters, they're not exactly meters, they're units of something. So it's important to say, okay, my beacon in this case has a 70-meter recommended search strip width. I know what that is, but now I'm going to go out and visually look at what 70 meters means to this beacon. And then I'm going to try to translate that into practicing that on a steeper slope, so that you can actually build some kinesthetic awareness around what the capabilities of your beacon are. So those are some things about the Barryvox. Again, both of the models have 70-meter search strip width. The Barryvox S will have the icons that you can see on the screen that remind you a general pattern, a zigzag pattern. It will remind you in the upper left corner that you have a 70-meter search strip width. And it will also remind you with the animated icon of the rescuer that you should be moving quickly at this juncture. It even goes so far in the animated icon to show the person holding the beacon at their ear. Once you have acquired a signal, of course, you're going to get an audible beep. And now you've acquired a signal, you're in course search mode, and you're going to get an arrow and you're going to get a number, just as every beacon out there. You're also going to get, again, an animated icon, in this case, indicating that you're slowing down a little bit. It's also showing you where we think you should be holding the beacon, which is at waist level and an arm's length away from you. An arm's length, because generally speaking, 50 centimeters is going to be more than adequate to eliminate any electrical interference. And at this point, again, you've got this moving arrow. Of course, you're intentionally changing the axis of the beacon to keep that arrow in alignment in the center. We always emphasize to people that if you're at a greater distance, 70, 60, 50, 40, even 30, we don't really care if the arrow is perfectly centered. We just care that you're moving quickly and the numbers going down. But a key point in the way that we teach best practices with beacons is that below 10, we expect the user to do whatever it takes to keep that arrow just pinned on center. And we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing, I'm going to have to scroll here. So again, this is what you're going to see when you're in signal search. Again, you get the reminder of the recommended search strip width. And then the key here is that if the beacon notices that there is electrical interference, which of course to the beacon is just going to sound like static noise or white noise, you are going to get indicators that there is electrical interference. You may get this icon in the upper right of a cell phone with a line through it. And you might also get the indicator saying, reduce your search strip width to 70 or to 20 meters, because of course the easiest, electrical interference and 457 signal are essentially competing noises. You don't have a way to effectively turn the volume of the target up. So the way that you can essentially the hack to turn the beacon that you're searching for, to turn that volume up, is to reduce your search strip width so that you inevitably get closer to it, which is going to make it sound louder and therefore overcome the effective electrical interference, which is static noise. So those are some indicators you're getting in signal search of electrical interference. Once you have a signal, you're in course search, this is what you're going to see. Again, if you do have multiple victims, you're going to see more than one, I call it a bobblehead on the right side of the screen. I'll show you a screenshot of that momentarily. So if you had two bobbleheads, you would actually see the number 2 in the lower right of the screen. And I believe that list of buried subjects can go upwards of 16, far beyond anything that's reasonable or realistic. The find search is something that Barryvox is really trying to focus a lot on, because we really believe we do a lot of video of rescuers, professional rescuers, IFMGA examiners, and it seems really clear that if a mistake is going to be made during a beacon search with any model or brand of beacon, it tends to be during find search. So we're going to great efforts to try to simplify find search, and the default setting on the Barryvox S is what they call smart search. And this is what you're going to see on the screen below 3 meters. And this is now, the same rules apply. You should be keeping your beacon in a fixed axis, whatever orientation you've come in on. You're no longer turning the orientation of the beacon. And now you are moving in the direction of the arrow. This is intentionally copied from GPS technology. It should look like your Google Maps or your Apple Maps. And you've got your arrow in a circle and your line, your road. you are intentionally supposed to be moving your beacon. I'm sorry about this. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me 1 second.
You're fine. You have a really cute helper. We won't hold it against you.
Sorry about that. So these icons are encouraging you to keep the beacon in a fixed axis and move it in the direction that the arrow is telling you to move it. You will potentially, if you move extremely slowly, get to a point where you see the number going up, but the arrow is still indicating to you that you should be moving in a certain direction. And if I kind of consider this piece of technology to be like a video game. You need to understand the video game, know the rules of the video game, and know how to optimize its use. So if you turn around before the arrow tells you to, it's probably going to default just to a cross, which tells you go ahead. You're not playing the video game. Go ahead and do your traditional grid search as you normally would. And what we've realized in watching people do that is it's also usually an indication that they can move faster, which we do believe is something that everybody could be doing, is moving faster. Of course, during find search, you should be slowing down relative to your speed during signal search or course search. But we really believe that people are moving in general too slowly during find search. And part of the reason we think people are doing that is because traditionally we're searching for unrealistically small targets. So of course, this again comes back to what is practical or realistic or easy in terms of setting up a drill. It's very difficult to set up drills with realistic size targets. But if you think about how that will affect how you train, if you know, for example, the Canadian Avalanche Association, an exam is a 30 centimeter by 30 centimeter target, not even remotely realistic to a life-size human being. I think the AMGA this year went to 45 centimeter by 45 centimeter targets, which is still not realistic to a human being. And when discussing this with people, a lot of people will say, oh, well, if you're always training for really small targets, then it must make you better. It must make you more accurate. But in fact, what we find it does, it encourages you to get to move much slower than you need to. And it also encourages you to get much closer to the snow surface than is necessary for the vast majority of incidents or accidents, which are going to be relatively shallow burials. So during find search, we advise people, instead of going to the snow surface, just to put the beacon at knee level. And again, since most burials are going to be shallow burials, we don't really find that extra 15 centimeters really gives you that much benefit. In fact, we really find that it inhibits people's ability to move at the speed they could be moving at. And as fluidly, it also makes it harder to step over blocks of hard debris or broken down trees or anything without having to lift the beacon up and down. And of course, keeping the beacon at a fixed elevation is a crucial piece of the find search with any brand or model beacon. So we are advising just going to the knee, and we find that it allows you to move a little smoother and a little faster. And this piece of software will kind of encourage you to do that, because it will work best at a certain speed. You've got to play with it to find that sweet spot. But in my experience, it's about a half a click faster than what most people do. You can see here in the bottom of the screen that one of the arrows is not in line with the road, so to speak. And so that means we want you to turn the axis of the beacon to get that arrow in line with the road again. Again, that can be a little counterintuitive because we spend so much time as educators stressing people not to change the orientation of the beacon. But if this Find Search software, the Smart Search, has the arrow out of alignment with the road, then it believes that you have inadvertently turned the axis of the beacon, and we want you to correct that. Finally, when the beacon determines that you have completed your grid search, because in all 4 directions the numbers are going up, or because simply you are very close to the victim, it is going to give you this probing icon saying you're done. It's also going to remind you what the best interval between probes is at 27 centimeters. And when this software works really well is going back into the course search. I said that we really want users below 10 meters to keep that arrow pinned at center. And when you do that, when you do a really diligent job during your course search at keeping that arrow pinned at center, what you'll find is you frequently will go straight to the probing icon and not have any of that kind of GPS style iconography. You will not have to do any grid searching, and you will have increased your speed for the final stage of your search dramatically. Does anybody have any questions on the 3 phases of the search: signal, course, or find search, and what they're seeing on the screen, or any questions regarding any of that?
And you can feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you and you can verbally ask your question.
All right, I'll keep going then. One of the things you may see in terms of quirks and troubleshooting is if during course search, the number is going up and even though the arrow is straight ahead, then as you probably are already teaching people, you need to turn 180 degrees. If you're, and we'll give you a U-turn, but frequently the user will see the numbers going up first and will be able to turn around on their own. If you see an excessive amount of U-turn symbols, it's frequently a sign that there's interference present. Maybe you're practicing near snowmaking equipment or power lines, or your phone is too close. But that's should be another clue of electrical interference. And of course, one of the biggest clues of interference is just a relatively large number that doesn't change regardless of where you go. So when we get people complaining that, oh, I had a signal and it was 35 and every direction I went, the number wasn't going down, that should be a good clue that you're getting electrical interference. Sorry, my slides aren't moving now. I might have to stop share and then reshare. Oh, I seem to have lost the ability to move the slides. Any clues there, Emma? I've never had this happen before.
I haven't either. We're experiencing a brave new world together. And so you just stopped sharing and reshared already.
Well, I'm trying to figure this out. I'll try to understand this question. You've got written share meters out when one run, walks, crawls. It's different for different beacons. I'm not sure I understand that question. Can anybody?
Yeah, so here's another thing that seems to only happen to me. For some reason, a bunch of folks who have joined are listed as Emma Walker. I'm pretty sure there are not that many other Emma Walkers who have joined. And this has happened to me before, and I have no idea why. I can't seem to figure it out. So whoever has put that question in the chat, would you mind raising your hand? And I'm going to call on you and have you ask it. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Okay. First of all, can you tell us who's on the line?
Hey, everybody. It's Brenda Holland out in Seattle. And I get students who have different beacons, and now I'm not quite sure what to say about when students are transitioning from running to walking to crawling. I give an answer that's not precise. It just depends on the situation. But I do recall, I've been around for a while, so I recall, 10 meters out, 5 meters out, now it's 3 meters out, and students have questions. Any thoughts on that you can share?
The way that we teach it, and again, the way that the icons on the screens indicate, is that if you're in signal search, you're moving as fast as possible. That in theory, that could be running. In theory, that could be skiing. And you're holding your beacon at your ear. In course search, once you've acquired a signal, you're holding your beacon at your waist at a full arm's length from you to eliminate the interference issue. And you're still moving. I mean, I guess you're still running, but you've slowed down a bit. And then in fine search, we're saying just go to your knee. And we're never recommending crawling. We really believe that the only time you need to be that close to the snow is if you have discovered that your lowest signal is a relatively, or your lowest number is a relatively high number and you suspect it to be a deep burial. But we really believe that for most cases, going to the snow is actually a detriment. We don't really think that crawling is a very ambulatory place to be. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thank you. That was helpful.
Thanks, Brenda. Okay, Doug, it looks like your slides are moving again.
Yeah.
No
So
thanks to me, but apparently some kind of Zoom magic. Thank you.
I think there was just a lag in loading this since it's in the cloud and not on my hard drive. Sorry. So we went through the 3 different stages of the search and, for single burials. If you have multiple burials, and like you can see in this upper right screen, you're going to see multiple bobbleheads. And you're only going to have the opportunity to mark when you are close to a certain victim. Okay. And so if there's ever, sorry, I'm going to back up a little bit. Okay. So these screenshots are showing a variety of different screenshots that show you multiple victims. So you've got room on the side of the screen for a certain number of these bobbleheads, maybe 3, and you could have a number that exceeds that, maybe 4, or in this case, you've got room for 2 bobbleheads, but the number says 3. So you can see that underneath the bobbleheads, there's a little arrow. So you can use the scrolling buttons on the side of the beacon to scroll through those victims after or after you've marked. And that is a very helpful tool, scrolling, that is not built into the default settings. So if you have multiple victims, let me back up here. I don't think I was terribly articulate there. Let's look at the top screen, the top image here where the number is 23. You've got 3 different bobbleheads and the number 3 here. In the default settings out of the box, you cannot scroll through the different victims in the list of buried subjects. You are forced to go to the victim that it believes is the closest, in this case at 23. When you get within a reasonable distance to it, definitely below 3 meters, it will say mark where this image of this person is, and then and only then will you have the opportunity to mark, and then it will move on to the next victim that it believes is the closest. So a couple things that this slide reminds me of. There will be some times where you see a bobblehead like these in this picture where they're filled in black, they're like silhouettes. And there'll be another time, I'll see if I've got the slide for you, where that bobblehead might only be an outline of the same image. And what that is that, as you probably are familiar with, it's difficult, it's a challenge for a beacon with a marking function to identify multiple 457 signals, because a lot of times they're overlapping on each other and it's just chaotic. So when you have a filled in bobblehead, That means that it hears 457 and it's got what I would refer to like as a clean lock on that signal. So it's listening to more than one beep and identifying that's a pattern that must belong to beacon X, beacon 1, or however you want to think about it. Now, there are times when a beacon might hear 457, but it's not part of a clean pattern, maybe because it's buried under other overlapping signals. And in that case, you will just get a silhouette of that bobblehead. You can go to it, but you'll never be able to mark it. And there is a good chance it will just disappear, because one of the things that can happen with electrical interference is that it can sound like 457 momentarily, and then it realizes it's not actually there, okay? So if that's kind of a nuanced thing if you happen to see this silhouette of a bobblehead. Now, like most beacons that have a marking function, you don't have the ability to choose who you're going to. The beacon is choosing it based on the signal separation algorithms and who it thinks is the closest. One of the things with the Barryvox S is that you've got settings that it comes with out of the box that are fairly basic, and those are the different stages of the search that I described, but you can kind of unlock a lot of different features. And one of those is pro settings. When you go into pro settings, one of the biggest advantages of pro settings is that you now have the ability to scroll with these two buttons on the side. So if, as these images show you, you have 3 victims, the top screen says that you've got 23, you could scroll through and it would take you a matter of, a couple seconds and confirm that your beacon has in fact selected the closest signal. Because as you all know, while these beacons are all very good at selecting the closest signal, it does not happen 100% of the time. So once you unlock the pro functions, the pro settings, you can now do a quick double check and scroll through them, okay? Or if you think, another thing that gets unlocked when you do pro check is you can unmark. If for some reason you're getting confused, you think you have mismarked something, you could unmark and start over. Any questions there? Finally, one of the other things that happens with pro settings is you can get access to analog tones. So we all know that, so this is an interesting one to me. So you've all probably drawn this on a whiteboard before, but typically in avalanche courses, people draw a 457 signal like a sine wave. And I'm not an electrical engineer, but I do know that beacons really have what, in terms of their 457 pattern, they have the time they're beeping, which we refer to as on time. And they have the time they're not beeping, the silent time, which we refer to as the off time. Overlapping signals, meaning beacons that, that are beeping at precisely the same time, make it very difficult for a beacon that has a marking function to build an accurate list of buried subjects and to mark at times and to properly select the closest victim to go to. So this slide is an indicator. The yellow and orange blocks are an image of where the on time is not overlapping. And the blue and yellow is in the first 2 of the 3 slides is where they are overlapping on the front edge of the yellow block. They refer to that as the leading edge, and that's being obscured, which means that the first 2 images of the blue and yellow are going to just sound like a long beep. And then eventually the 2 beeps will be heard. So while overlapping signals are not terribly common, they are one of the things that can complicate searches with beacons that have a marking function. And the most surefire way to handle that and problem solve that and troubleshoot that is through the use of analog tones. But before I get deeper into that, I'm just going to check We have another question here. Can we unmark in non-pro settings? No, you cannot. You can, generally speaking, scrolling and unmarking for the vast majority of rescuers is a bad idea. Because most often the beacons work so well that it's unnecessary to do that. And you're kind of opening up a Pandora's box where people can start inadvertently complicating the search because they're confused. So we don't provide that as part of the default settings. We provide that only when you go into pro settings, because we think those should be those uses should be reserved for people that really know what they're doing and are taking the time to learn that. So a couple things that make, oh, now my slides are stalling again. I'll just keep talking. But a couple things, again, this overlapping signal issue is one of the things that makes any beacon with a marking function underperform. So with older technology, okay, and with any technology that it does not use a marking function, it's less important for those beacons to, I'm going to reset and rephrase. Beacons that are using a marking function are automatically, regardless of brand, incentivized to make other beacons that have a marking function easy to operate well. So one of the things that most beacons that have a marking function have done to make it easier to build lists of buried subjects and find the closest victim using that list of buried subjects, essentially making their signal separation algorithms work better, is they have shortened the duration of the beep. Okay, if I give people a homework assignment and say, I want you to go into the engineering lab and come out with a beacon that never overlaps with another identical beacon, and we don't care at all if this beacon is useful for avalanche rescue. We just want to be able to turn these two identical beacons on at the exact same time and set them on a table and know that they're not going to overlap ever. Okay. What you're going to see people coming out with is they're going to say, okay, I'll make a beacon and it's going to beep once for a millisecond every year. Okay, now I'm pretty certain I could turn two beacons on and they're never going to overlap. And if they do happen to beep at the same time, I bet it's not going to happen for another 10 years. Okay, obviously that beacon is useless for avalanche rescue, but the point is that if you reduce the duration in milliseconds of the beep and increase the silent time, you're dramatically reducing the chances of overlap occurring. And that's one of the biggest reasons not to use older technology. I know guides, I worked with a New Zealand guide in the not too distant past that used this Barryvox F1, and he was exceptionally good at finding 3 and 4 beacons in incredibly fast time. And he would say, well, why would I retire that beacon? And the biggest reason to retire that older technology is that if there are multiple beacons buried, there is a much greater chance of overlapping occurring. And not only that, there's a much greater chance that that overlap will last for a very long time, maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes. If you are using modern technology and the multiple targets buried, then overlap is much more likely to occur. And not only that, it has the potential to last for a very long time. And this is an interesting topic when you think about how you're setting up your drills, because I am quite certain that if you bury older technology, which is a very common practice, people retire a fleet of beacons and they say, oh, now I'll keep these and I'll use them for training. And so they're burying older technology. And I saw that. I was working with the TGR guys at IPRW, the International Pro Riders Workshop that they did this year. And they had lots of multiple burial setups. And there were a variety of people searching with a variety of brands and models of beacons that had marking functions. And they definitely were underperforming because there was so much overlap occurring with the old buried targets, that it just made it very challenging for the beacons to build these lists of buried subjects and effectively search for the closest victim. So that's just an interesting thing to think about when you set up targets. It's also one of the reasons why beacon parks can really make beacons that have marking functions look like they're underperforming. A common thing that I've seen, and I've seen this with multiple brands of beacon parks, my beacon very quickly finds the first one, I mark it, I start moving towards the second one, and it drags me back to the first one. And again, one of the reasons for that is that what I'm describing, these shortened beeps and longer silence time. And then another thing that a lot of brands of beacons do, I know Barryvox and Arva does it, is we change the off time, the silent time, between literally beacon number 1 and beacon number 2 and beacon number 3 and so on and so forth that are coming out of manufacturing, so that the silent time has a difference in milliseconds between the different units coming out of manufacturing. And that way, even if you did miraculously turn 2 beacons on at exactly the same time and they do start overlapping, they will diverge from that overlap in a matter of seconds. So that's why with the pulse beacon, still struggling. I'm sorry to move my, I'm going to stop and start my share again. I can't move my slideshow.
While we give it a second to catch up, we have another question in the chat. Someone's asking, how old is considered old technology for beacons and to retire? And they give the Tracker 2 as an example.
I am not an expert with every beacon out there, so I don't think I can say whether or not I would consider a Tracker 2 old technology. I would certainly consider anything that doesn't have 3 antennas to be old technology. I'm pretty certain the Tracker 2 has 3 antennas. And I don't know about how they've addressed their timing, but I do know that because trackers, especially before the Tracker 3, had no kind of signal suppression or marking function of any kind, that I do believe that those beeps were longer and that overlap was more common. But I think I'm going to kick the can on that and say you're going to have to test that yourselves a little bit.
I think that just quick aside, I was just talking to our technical director, Steve Conger, about this, and it sounds like he's hearing about 5 years is pretty typical for folks saying that it's time to get a new beacon. I will say that someone just gave one of my other backcountry partners a really hard time for having a Tracker 2. So this has been on my mind a lot.
I'm going to stop sharing because I can't. I'll try again here in a second. That is a really interesting topic that I've spoken to the engineers that build Barryvox beacons in Switzerland quite a bit about. And I'll come back to that question about summarizing overlapping signals. So one of the coolest things about the Berryvox beacon platform is this thing right here. Can you see this? This Berryvox Tester it's fairly expensive, so it's not something that everybody is going to have sitting around, but it tests every single function, including the amount of power consumption it's using and the strength of the 457. I mean, it really tests everything about the Barryvox, about the individual unit. And because of that, in conjunction with regular firmware updates, you could take this pulse beacon right here. I'd have to look up the actual serial number, but the first year we manufactured a pulse Barryvox was in 2006, so 15 years ago. This beacon has the most recent firmware on it, which is 4.2, which is maybe 4 years old. And I can test it on that diagnostic tester, and it tests perfectly well. It can even, if you're a commercial group that wants documentation, you can even have a report of that. And if that beacon is working perfectly well according to the tester, and I don't notice any odd behavior with it, then I feel extremely confident using that beacon. Now, a current model is going to have advantages. For example, it has a longer recommended search strip width. It has better signal separation algorithms. It is a better beacon. But that pulse beacon, if it's testing out with diagnostic tester and it has the most updated firmware, is a perfectly reasonable beacon to use. And from the perspective of the engineers who design and build the beacons, there's absolutely no reason to retire that beacon. Now, from the viewpoint of like a guide service or a ski patrol, they're probably going to retire it anyways. But the point is that from our perspective, we have an extreme amount of confidence in that beacon because it can get tested. And to me, that is a huge advantage just from like kind of a sustainability perspective, that you're not just retiring your beacon just because someone says it's 5 years. If you don't have the ability to do those tests and all you're relying on is a range test in a field, you really haven't tested everything. You should have a fair bit of confidence based on range alone, but there could be a number of other things that go wrong with beacons. And believe me, just from being part of the customer service team, these are plastic electronics and stuff does go wrong, whether it's speakers or screens or whatever. So with our beacons, I would say they should be, we recommend that they're tested a minimum of every 3 years. Although I always tell people that if you have access to a diagnostic tester, because maybe a local ski patrol has one or a search and rescue group, I test mine every year. I certainly find beacons where there's problems. So, definitely get them tested whenever you can, but no more, at least every 3 years. And another big one is make sure you're on current firmware. But in terms of when you retire other beacons, yeah, I think a lot of people are going to say 5 years, but it's pretty arbitrary.
Doug, I just got on the Zoom FAQs, and apparently this is a thing that people's PowerPoint slides will freeze while they're sharing in Zoom. And it sounds like the way that people have been able to get past it is to hop out of the meeting and jump back in. So if you want to do that with the that panelist invitation, totally fine. I don't know how many more slides you have if you want to do that.
I will do that really quickly and see what happens. I'll be back.
Thanks for bearing with us through our technical difficulties, folks.
All right, I'm back. I'll try to reshare. Of course, my PowerPoint disappeared and closed. I'm sorry for this. Let's just right now, was there another question? What are the ways to update the Berryvox firmware? You can always send into to Mammut in Vermont, and there are a lot of shops and stuff, that dealers that may have a W-link stick, because the diagnostic tester that I showed you earlier is the only device that does all the testing. But to do the firmware updates, all you need is this USB stick and the required software on your computer. So there's a lot of dealers that have those around. But the simplest answer is send it into Mammut. And obviously, we get a lot of requests to do that stuff in October and November, and it would be much easier and more reliable to get it back in time if you were doing it in the summer months, when you're probably less likely to be using your beacon. I'm going to try sharing again. Can you see my screen right now? I'm in share mode, right?
Yep, we can. Oh, yep. Now I can see the
There we
PowerPoint.
go. So in the event that overlapping is occurring and not, again, with modern beacons, they should separate fairly quickly. So if your beacon has identified two subjects and it is following one, and then the one it's following is essentially dropped, so to speak, because of overlap, the beacon will keep you going on the same or similar trajectory, knowing that in a few seconds, those signals should separate out again. I think about it like satellite radio. When people first got satellite radio, if you drove through a tunnel, you would lose your song instantly. Now, you can drive through the Eisenhower tunnel, right? You can drive 3, 4, 5 minutes and not lose your song because it's pre-buffered. So similarly, a piece of technology in this beacon is that knowing it, because it knows overlap can and does occur, if it notices that drop, it's going to keep you going on that trajectory for a little bit. And after a few seconds, if those signals have not reemerged, then it's going to give you this symbol that you see on the screen where the 46 has these lines coming out from it, which is a warning saying slow down, because again, time is what is going to be the simplest thing to separate those signals again. With the Pulse Barryvox, we used to give people a symbol that would say stop, stand still, which people said, oh, it's a slow processor. It was actually very smart. It saw two signals. It noticed that one essentially was behind the other due to overlap. It knows that giving it time will likely lead to the separation of those. So it was asking you to slow down, but it was a very frustrating symbol to get. So one of the updates from the Pulse to the Barryvox S is that we're going to give you no indication and just keeping you on the same trajectory. And then after a certain amount of time, we're going to give you this icon saying slow down. And this buffering technology, so to speak, does work very well, because I have actually never seen this symbol other than in the user manual. How are we doing on time, Emma? Because I could talk for forever.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. I'm happy to stick around. If folks have a few more minutes, I'm happy to stick around since we're recording this. If you need to hop off and take care of dinner, family stuff, or whatever, we can stick around and keep recording as long as Doug has time, and then I'll post this to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So I do not personally have a time limit, but
okay, well, I'll keep going. There's one more topic that's important to get into, which is these pro settings. To get into the pro settings, when you turn the beacon on, of course, like most beacons now, it's going to do a simple self-diagnostic self-check. It's going to tell you that it's gotten through that self-check. And then for a limited amount of time, you're going to see a settings wheel in the upper right corner. And if you use these scroll buttons, you scroll to that settings wheel and you press your orange button on the front of the screen to select the settings, and then you can get into these pro settings. When you go into pro settings, again, now you've opened up the ability to scroll if you're looking for multiple targets. You also have the ability now to change your audio tones from digital, which is the default setting, to analog. And the advantage of analog is it's going to be much easier to identify the presence of overlap, because anytime a digital beacon is giving you digital sound, that is just an artificial sound as a means of encouragement, right? We go into a sound lab, we say, what do we want it to sound like when they acquire a signal? We could do whatever we want, okay? We can do fireworks, we can do sirens, we can do beer cans popping, we can do whatever. And then we're gonna say, what do we want it to sound like at 40 meters? And generally speaking, we're gonna increase the cadence and the speed as we get closer. And what we're not gonna do is give you audio sound relevant to two different targets. That sound is going to be relative to one target. So it's going to be impossible from a sound perspective to identify overlap. And you're not going to see an indication of overlap on the screen. So any digital only beacon is really not going to give you much of a clue to that overlap. So having access to listening to the analog tones is going to be the most surefire way to identify that. It's not exactly an intuitive process. It's a process that does take a lot of time. And before I go into that process, the thing that I'll point out is the easiest way to dramatically reduce the chances of ever having to deal with a rescue with problems due to overlap is to be searching for modern technology. So I've done these trainings with these advanced analog techniques before with groups like Telluride Helitrax that use Barryvox beacons. And Joe Schultz said to me, do we really need to do this if every one of our clients is using a Barryvox beacon? And the answer is probably not. But if you're a rescuer that could be rescuing any variety of beacons, all kinds of models, all kinds of ages, then the chances of overlap goes up. And the most surefire way to identify when overlap is occurring and have a backup technique for how to solve those problems is the use of analog. So if you were ever a user of this beacon or any other analog only beacon, you're familiar with the fact that when you go to search, you're starting out at your longest range, which with this beacon back in the day was 80 meters. And you knew that because that was what your dial was set at, is you can only hear between 80 and 60 meters at that point. Okay, and then you would compare left, center, right, and if they were all equal volume, you would turn it. You would turn the setting down, and that's how you knew you were getting closer. With the Barryvox, when you're getting analog sound, you're not in control of that dial. It's turning the volume down for you. So you're using at this point a digital beacon and an analog beacon at the same time. The screen indicators are digital in terms of distance and direction, but now you've got analog acoustics. So you might give a loud beep, and as you move closer, suddenly it's a very low volume beep because it got turned down. So you cannot assess proximity based on the volume that you hear. The reason you're listening to the analog is to determine how many do I hear and what possible range are they in. So if your screen says 50 and you hear 2 beeps, then you know the closest victim is no more than 50 meters away. And the second victim that you hear could always be 150% of that. So it could be 75 meters away. Similarly, if you're at 3 meters and you hear 2 analog beeps, that means the closest one is at 3 meters or less, and the furthest one can be no more than 4.5 meters away. The way that that's most crucial is that if you hear multiple beeps at a medium range, and then you hear only 1 beep when you're at a very low number, that means you know that they're reasonably spread apart. Whereas if you're at a really low number and you still hear 2 beeps, you know you have a close proximity situation. So I had a good learning experience once where I was doing a training with a group, and both myself and another rescuer turned our digital beacons to search. We were told by the witness there was only one, or there were 2 victims. Both of our beacons, different brands and models, gave only 1 target. We both assumed, because it was the simplest answer, that the second target was outside of the range. We both went and found that first target. We hit it with a probe. We knew we'd found it. We marked it. And our beacons now told us to go into signal search mode, meaning they did not hear another signal. At that point, the other rescuer starts working down the slope, searching for the second signal, again, using the assumption that victim number 2 is just out of the range. I'm standing there, and I was using a pulse at the time, and I can feel victim number 1. So I know I'm extremely close, and I hear 2 analog tones. I know that if I'm that close to victim number 1, that my range for my analog audio has been turned down extremely low, and there must be a victim very close to me. So now I've gotten an indication, because of my use of analog, that there is a second victim close to me. I would not have that information if I was using a digital only beacon of any make or model. And now, because the analog information is not congruent with the digital information, I know I might as well shut off the digital altogether, go to analog only, because analog only is an exceptionally good tool to do a micro search strip or a 3-circle method or any of these other alternative search modes that essentially force you to get very close to the other victim. And the reason it's important to turn off the digital is because the digital with a marking beacon is always going to determine which beacon it thinks is the closest, and it's going to lock onto it. And you don't ever want that locking mode. That's not helpful for you anymore. That's helpful for most people in most multiple burial scenarios, but it is not helpful when you're using an alternative search strategy, like a micro search strip. If you want to review micro search strips or 3-circle method, there's tons of information about that online because we've been using and teaching those skills for 30 years. They're still very effective when you're using a strength-based technology like analog, or for example, like a tracker 2 is exceptionally good at micro search strips because it doesn't have a marking function, so it doesn't have a lock. The only detriment there is you don't know when to start using it necessarily. So when you're using digital and analog at the same time in these pro settings, you now have a clue for when you might actually benefit from going to an alternative search strategy like a micro search strip. So again, the pro setting has a lot of capabilities. If you decide you don't, once you go into pro mode, if you decide you want to customize it further, say you don't want to use that smart search function, which is that fine search GPS style searching below 3 meters, and just get a classic cross and do your own grid search, you could change it to that. You could be in pro settings and continue to use digital sound if, for example, like the Telluride guides, maybe they think it's unnecessary to have the analog tones, but they want access to scrolling, so they could go into pro mode, keep the digital sound, but have access to the scrolling and the unmarking. So it does offer a lot of variety in terms of how you want to customize that unit once you go into pro settings. But if you use it in the default settings out of the box, which I would assume most people are that are in Avalanche courses, I think we went through pretty succinctly the different phases of the search there. And in terms of learning this beacon, because it's impossible to create experts in an hour and a half, I do want to emphasize that the document that comes with the beacon is not very complete. The complete user manual is something that you need to download online, and it's the Barryvox S Extended Reference Manual. And I will end this by sharing my screen and showing you. If you scroll down to product support, you can, on the bottom of the Mammut page, you can go to user manuals, and then you can, I appear to be in airbags. Product support, Barryvox, user manuals, Barryvox S manual, extended reference guide in English. And this is where you're going to download the most complete document. It's going to cover a lot more stuff than what we covered here. And I definitely would consider that to be required information for anybody that's really trying to have a comprehensive knowledge of the Barryvox S. So I think I'm going to finish up by looking at these questions. What are the ways to update the Barryvox firmware? Again, you can send it to us or use a local dealer. Pro settings would be great. I'm not sure how to answer that if somebody wants to expand on that question. Can you comment on using the word transceiver over beacon? Hearing there's a move away from beacon because it signifies a one-way signal like a personal locator beacon. I have not heard that. While I can understand where that comes from, it sounds like a bit of semantics to me. I know people that still refer to them as peeps, which obviously, since I work for Mammut, I don't. But I don't find that to be incredibly important one way or the other. But yes, a transceiver would be more accurate since it does have multiple functions. Emma, any other questions?
It looks like there was one in the Q&A, but it looks like you answered it as you were finishing up. And then I think the comment about pro settings was just as you were saying, if we had a few more minutes that you could talk a bit about that, and then you did. So
okay, then I found one more in the Q&A. Why doesn't the transceiver auto switch to the closest signal when you move between multiple transmitters? It seems to eliminate the user's ability to fall back to the 3-circle method and micro search strips. This is a great question. And the reason for that is that if you think back to older beacons that didn't have marking, like this or a tracker 2, if you have a tracker 2 and you have 2 or 3 victims out there, then the numbers are flashing back and forth: 1.2, 3.6, 4.8, 1.4, 3.8, 4.2. And it's the user that has to disseminate that information and make decisions about which is the closest and how to get closer to that number. It's possible, it's doable with a lot of practice, but for the vast majority of people, giving them one number that the beacon believes is the closest is going to be the fastest, most effective technique, even in the rare instances when it has not selected the closest victim. If, to this person's point, it auto switched, then that's the same thing as the number flipping back and forth. If you're equidistant between 2, it's going to be difficult. If you're just slightly closer to one than the other, it's going to want to flip back and forth. It's going to be, it totally makes sense why you're saying that. But I think at the end of the day, it's kind of like having your cake and wanting to eat it too. You cannot have a super simple platform for a multiple burial where you direct someone where to go and also give them access to a beacon that flips back and forth between the different targets. The best thing we can do there, though, is provide you with the opportunity to scroll. So if you scroll, you can very quickly make sure that your beacon has picked the closest victim. And if it hasn't, you can very easily and quickly switch. So that's our best way to give you a simple platform for multiples that is sticking with the decision it's made, which is very important for most scenarios, but does give you the option to override without providing that confusion of flashing numbers. But the bottom line is that the strongest platform for doing those micro search strips of the 3-circle method is going to be to go to analog only once you've identified that there's an issue.
Awesome. Any other, oh, I see that someone has their hand raised, so I'm going to give them permission to talk.
Hi, I think it's related to the same issue. Sorry, my name's Wendy. I work ski patrol at Mount Rose and also teach classes, but I've noticed that it's people get very challenged when they try to do a group check with the Berryvox when they don't use the group check function, when they're only using the search function, because it doesn't want to jump between multiple signals. It stays locked on the signal. So do you?
That's a great question. It makes me realize how many topics I didn't cover. But yeah, so again, for a beacon that is trying to employ a marking function to work really well, the whole premise is that when the beacon has made the selection, the vast majority of time, it's going to be better for that user to go to that victim, mark it, and then go to the second victim, even if the beacon misselected the closest one the first time, because it's generally a rare thing. And we're trying to make multiple drills as simple as possible. So all beacons, regardless of manufacturer, that have a marking function are going to generally lock on. That's because what we're trying to avoid is that switching back and forth of, like back in the day, using a beacon that didn't have marking and it was just constantly flip-flopping. So it's important to remember that that locking is intentional. But of course, that locking comes with with drawbacks. And one of those is that, if you're doing a trailhead check and you just go to search and have 4 people walk past you, the first person, you could get a low number, they walk past you, your beacon is still locked on them. Second person comes up to you, you're not getting a low number because it's still locked on the person moving away. So every beacon that has a marking function that I know of has a built-in group check, which essentially eliminates that lock, because we're trying to do something different here. You're essentially trying to do a search where your targets are moving around, okay? So when you go to group check and you access that by turning on the beacon, it says group check across the bottom for 3 seconds, and you hit that button, and now you see that icon. It tells you that you should be 1 meter from the victim you're trying to, or the person you're trying to check. The diagram shows you each of the other people 3 meters away. And then if you have a signal that is more than a meter away, you will simply not hear anything. Let's see if I can demonstrate. No, there's too much computers in here. It's telling me multiple transmitters. If you're too far away, you're just not going to get a signal. If you're at that ideal meter, you're going to get your beep. If you're closer than that, it's going to tell you you're too close. Now, and when you do a group check in group check mode, you're not only testing that the beacon you're testing has a 457 signal, you're also testing that the strength of that beacon is adequate, because your receiving volume, so to speak, has been turned down so low that if you're at a meter and you can hear it, it doesn't just tell you that that's a 457, it also tells you it's a very strong, good signal. So you're testing the integrity of the signal as well as the accuracy of the signal. If you don't need to test the integrity of the signal because you just did it yesterday, or because you're working with a fleet of beacons that gets diagnostic testing and you have extreme confidence in the beacons, you could go all the way to the chest of the person you're trying to check. Even though it's screaming too close, you see a 0.1 on your screen and you go. And that would be a much faster way to do a trailhead check in instances when you have extreme confidence in the unit. In instances where you don't have confidence, in pro settings, you also have a pro check mode where you verify the accuracy of the 457. You verify the timing of the on of the beep and the off, because those are regulated by all manufacturers. There's an allowable milliseconds for the duration of the beep and the duration of the silence. And you can check all of those functions. If you're, say you show up on a trip and everybody's got a whole bunch of different beacons, different ages, and you want to do that check there. And that hopefully answers the question of, are you able to check other transceivers frequencies with the S model? The answer is yes. Using the pro check mode, you can verify the accuracy of the 457. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. Thanks.
I see another one. Can you expand on the Barryvox to Berryvox heartbeat setting? So the Barryvox S has an accelerometer in it, which is just a motion sensor. It gets used for a variety of different functions. The first function they ever used it for was with the pulse. If you're buried and your beacon is in your chest harness on your chest, and your chest is rising just ever so slightly, then the motion sensor will alert another beacon that is vital data enabled, which would be a pulse, a Barryvox S, or some models of ARVA. The searching beacon will show a heart next to that person, indicating that there's movement. So in theory, if you had a fleet, say at a guide service, and you had multiple people buried, you could have a situation where the person who's buried deeper has a heart, the person who's buried shallowly does not have a heart, and you could in theory use that for triage. The other way that accelerometer gets used is we have a rescue send feature on the Barryvox S. So rescue send is very popular with dog handlers or with people that are designated probers or shovelers and want to be on site while someone's doing a beacon search. They don't want to turn their beacon off because there's hang fire. They don't want to turn their beacon to send because it's noisy and distracting to the person doing a beacon search. You turn it to rescue send. And now, even though your switch is in send mode, you're not actually sending a signal. And if your motion sensor, your accelerometer realizes you're not moving, it will then re-engage sending after 2 minutes. The accelerometer also gets used in lieu of auto revert. Most beacons have an auto revert function where after 4 or 8 minutes, sometimes you can adjust it, sometimes you can't. The beacon in search mode will just revert to send. I can attest to personal experience where that has been extremely confusing in real situations where people's beacons have auto reverted and rescuers were distracted and brought over to that signal. So we have incorporated the accelerometer into this, where the revert to send will never revert to send unless the motion sensor has identified that you've stopped moving. So that is the answer to the heartbeat setting, or what they call vital data.
Awesome. Do folks have other, let's see, looks like no raised hands. Any other questions from folks? Awesome. Doug, thank you so much. I learned a lot. This was awesome. And this whole using older beacons as practice has given me some food for thought to bring back to the AIRI team as well. Yeah, that's really interesting. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. And Doug, thank you as well. I am just gonna quickly drop a link in the chat to our webinar series because we have one more coming up with ARVA. A number of folks have let me know they're not very familiar with ARVA products. And so this will be a good one to get a little more familiar with those. So I'm gonna
Is Jeremy Jolly doing it?
He is, yeah.
Jeremy's awesome. I would encourage you all to attend that one.
Awesome. Thank you. Please do attend. Yeah. So you all know how to get there. And then also now we're recording, and Doug, if it's okay, I'll copy you when I send that out. So folks have your email address if they have questions.
That would be great. So you'll send me the link for that recording?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.